We've heard from David Littleproud this week, obviously, Bridget McKenzie, of course, Barnaby Joyce. They are really playing up the regional-urban divide.
It's not true to say that you can have no power outside of a coalition government.
It does give them that opportunity to think differently, to think outside what their normal parameters are.
Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Bridie.
And good morning, Gabby.
Morning, Bridie.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's been years since you've been on the Friday show.
I know.
And
it is.
Great to see you. Now, I'm going to jump right in. It has been an extraordinary week, month, year in Australian politics. The fallout from the coalition split has continued. There's been a lot of analysis of this, but I think, Gabby, a lot of those views have come out of Canberra, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. And I've been quite surprised, actually, at how monotone they are. I thought there would be a bit more sort of lateral thought, I guess, about this. And I guess it's no surprise in a way, because as political reporters, we're often steeped in the traditions that we've seen in the recent future. But actually, if you take a longer term view and look at the history of the National Party and the Country Party as it was before, there's always been this kind of wrestle over how power should be leveraged. Like, what is the best way to use power as a party representing rural interests, and whether that's inside the tent or outside the tent.
So what kind of lateral thinking do you think has been missing from the analysis this week?
Well, for example, my view is that it's a great idea to split. And I've always thought a split was the best way to serve rural people, particularly in opposition. Certainly the political class and commentators are steeped in this idea of majority government and majority politics. But we know politics is fracturing now. And rural people have always been a minority. You know, we're 30% at best. Like, you grew up in the country, Bridie. You understand this, right?
And my family in the country are listening to this episode right now.
Absolutely, right? So it's not true to say that you can have no power outside of a coalition government. The same commentators that are lauding the Teals on the crossbench and the community independents are saying, oh, this is the worst thing ever for the Nats. They will never be able to, grab power again. Certainly they will not have their bums on ministerial seats, probably, if they don't join with the Liberals. But they can join with the Liberals when it comes to an election or after an election. As we see in Europe, the coalition agreements are made after the election, when everyone knows how many MPs they have, when everyone is really clear about how much power they wield. I don't think it's a bad thing. And honestly, if it makes anyone get off their ass and do some policy work, well, here. I'm all for that.
Well, we can live in hope. I just want to bring Mike into the conversation here. We've heard from David Littleproud this week, obviously, Bridget McKenzie, of course, Barnaby Joyce. They are really playing up the regional-urban divide. Do you think that's real, or do you think it is being played up for political advantage?
I mean, there are just so many interesting elements in here. I feel like we could talk. This might be a long episode. Clearly, it's in the, it's kind of the Nats' raison d'etre to play up the regional city divide, because that's the constituency they represent. But whether the city-country divide exists, I mean, they talk about it does, clearly. I'm sure Gabby can talk to this a lot more than city people can from a rural or regional perspective. But a lot of the issues that they talk about animating them in the country are the same as the ones that people talk about in the cities, like childcare, for example. Just because you live in the city doesn't mean it's easy or cheap to get childcare. Mobile phone reception, fair enough. It's much worse once you go outside the inner cities. But there are a lot of cost of living generally, services generally, yes, they're worse in many country areas, but they're not. It's not like everyone in the city's having a good time and everyone in the country struggling. That's obviously probably an unfair representation of what they're saying, but there is a bit of that. Barnaby Joyce saying, comparing Bellevue Hill and Weeabonga, and Bridget McKenzie saying, whether you live in Coogee or Cobar, access to reliable mobile coverage should be fundamental. Yeah, true, but they're kind of setting it up as this very stark divide, which I think is a bit overblown.
And what do you think, Gabby? Do you think I think there is a palpable feeling of being ignored in the regions. How legitimate do you think that feeling of being ignored is?
I think this is an identity issue. There's some really good work that's been done at the ANU around climate, and on the big ticket priorities and items like climate change and social issues, there's not actually that much difference in views between city and country people, but country people really identify as having different views. So it's our identification that causes the difference, which is kind of very meta in a way, or I don't know, like that movie Inception. It does my head in when I try and think about it. So it's this identity that and feeling of being ignored, even though, as Mike points out, the votes that rural people can leverage power on are actually quite substantial. The other thing I want to point out is there's actually quite a bit of influence, not just in the National Party. The Liberal Party actually holds more country seats than the National Party, and people often forget this. And so there's this big rural rump inside the Liberal Party. I mean, look at the leadership now. So Susan Ley has a country seat. It's Farrer. It's a massive seat right along the border of New South Wales and Victoria, stretching all the way to the western boundary of the state. Ted O'Brien is a rural MP. He's the deputy. He's in Fairfax in Queensland. The challengers, Angus Taylor was a rural MP. His seat's now been reclassified out of Metropolitan because it was pushed up in the redistribution. Jacinta Price is in the Northern Territory. The whole thing's rural regional, right? So there is a lot,
particularly since they lost a lot of their urban seats. Even further.
So there is a lot of influence. For me, it's how you use that influence and what priorities you focus on. And I guess the biggest one that stands out is always climate, because having pushed the climate change action down, kick the can down the road, deny, and then pivot and say, not economically viable to change. As, I'm talking to farmers who've had to replant their third crop in a row for flooding. All of these issues have just been ignored. So I think the split will work if the National Party can put aside the ideology that drives a lot of its campaigning and acknowledge some crucial issues on the ground to rural people. And when you think about that list of the four issues, what was it? Supermarket divestiture, nuclear policy, the regional fund and phone coverage. Nukes is obviously out. But those other three policies are all policies that they could deal with any party on. They could do a deal with the Labor Party on them. In fact, the Labor Party, its history and its social platform is more likely to go with those issues than the Liberal Party. But the Nats have always dealt themselves out of using their power in a different way to get what they want for their constituency. And so what it looks like is the Nats are more interested in their own power for power's sake rather than the power of their rural constituency.
I completely agree with you that there's no reason in theory why they should not go to an election as separate parties, and move into coalition after an election if they have the numbers to do so, just as Labor and the Greens could do so, or Labor and Independents potentially could do so. It doesn't have to be a formal coalition, just to pass legislation to get as a minority government. One obstacle obviously is they've just gone to an election saying minority government would cause complete chaos, and we can't possibly countenance anything like that. Obviously, we don't know that this is actually going to happen, that they go to the next election. It's probably highly unlikely that they will stay apart that long. But just for the moment, suppose they did, it's perfectly possible to make an agreement after an election, or to just agree to pass legislation on its merits. But you can see that happening on the left, plausibly, but between the Libs and the Nats, climate is that big sticking point, isn't it? If the Liberals come up with a credible climate policy, which we don't know yet, and the Nats stick with nuclear or some other, or go further towards climate denialism, want to get out of Paris, etc., that feels unbridgeable.
Yeah, and that's where they have to meet the voters where they are, right? So if they don't do a deal on that and they send themselves to irrelevancy, then so be it. Like, we'll see who's got no underpants, in a policy sense, or no connection with their voters. Like, if this generation, my kids' generation, who are in their 20s, who are now, the largest, I always mix up the generations, but is it the millennials, right?
Millennials and Zoomers together.
Yeah. Right? So if they can't relate to that generation, and might I add that generation has really moved into the regions in a big way. All the demographic data shows that they're moving into country towns because they can't get housing in the city, right? So all of these regional centres are changing, and if the Nats are going to make this bold move and split from the coalition, they're going to have to find a way to relate to those age groups, because they're going to be using the childcare. They're going to be sending their kids to schools in country towns. They'll want to see the policies of the Nats, and if they can't relate to them, they're kind of dead meat in the longer term. I don't think the Nats are dead as a party by any means. I think there's a great there is a lot of power in just simply getting up and saying that one thing: we are just for rural Australia. And half of the party might want to go, down the yellow brick road to Trump land, and the other half might get into a different space of a more centrist policy platform that really reflects the fact that, and their roots, which are agrarian socialism. Like, it's not a right-wing economic party in its history. So how will it deal with that and trying to maintain a contract between city and country people about, sharing resources, sharing services? I think that's going to be the really interesting thing over the next term.
Interesting you mentioned young people moving into the regions. I think although the Nats vote held up pretty well in the election, there were some seats where the independents vote rose significantly, so it's up around the 30% mark. Cowper, I think, and Richmond. That's not it. They haven't made a breakthrough there, but there is kind of movement under the waves. I know you've been writing and talking about this for a long time, Gabby, and it hasn't quite happened yet.
The rise of the independents, the most recent rise of the independents, started in the country. It was Cathy McGowan in Indo.
And the model that the Teals used was Cathy McGowan and Voices for Indi model. That's kept Helen Haynes in power there. And that's the thing. Like, commentators have celebrated a kind of new way of doing politics in the community independence. But, if the Nats choose to try something different, maybe we should all sort of pause and just see what happens. Now, it may be that they've stumbled accidentally on a new formula that works for them as a party, and in spite of themselves, that they might they might stumble on something that works really for the next few terms. But let's see what happens.
How do you think the split has been received by voters in the bush, Gabby?
It's hard to tell, partly because I haven't been out much this week. I've seen a few sheep, but I haven't seen any.
What do the sheep think?
So I've talked to quite a few people, and I think there's a bit of holding breath, a bit of excitement. I had one person ringing me saying, "Oh, this could be really great for rural Australia." I've had coalitionists who are more, I think our best place is with the Liberal Party, and so very much in that old kind of headspace of, everything is about government. Well, maybe sometimes if you're a minority voter, which we are, maybe sometimes other things will work better.
I do wonder if the Nats could struggle in the short term or medium term to get airtime, to get interviewed by the ABC on policy stories, not just the ABC, any media outlet. I was just using that as any example. Could there be a risk that they are going to struggle a little bit to be heard without that seat at the table with the Liberals?
I mean, they won't have shadow ministerial positions, so in that sense they won't be the obvious people to go to as spokespeople on any given issue. But I think it would be really interesting to see how that worked, because then they would have to work harder to get into the media and come up with interesting and productive things to say, hopefully that get them noticed, and that might be a good thing as well for them and for sort of debate generally.
And Gabby, do you think that there's a chance of the Libs and Nats ever getting back together?
See what you did there, Bridie.
Yeah, I think they will. I just think it's a really interesting experiment, and I don't discount it the way a lot of other people have. And the other point to make, I think, is around John Howard, who's been out this week talking about what a bad thing it is. I think it's hard for the Liberal Party, right? So it takes away the foundation for getting closer to government. But I just think it's just such a kind of bad reason to be there. If you have a separate agenda, then I think you should mark out your territory really clearly and be very transparent with the voters. And I think that's not what we see when the two parties are in coalition.
I hope this lasts for a while at least, just because it's made people think a bit differently already about how politics could be, even if it's not the end result that they stay separate. Letting both the parties loose does give them that opportunity to think differently, to think outside what their normal parameters are. They probably will come back together again, but I hope maybe in a more productive way if that's how it works out.
Don't go anywhere. We have got more Full Story after the break. But in the meantime, like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads this week. Gabby, what was that for you?
Oh, the floods up north. I'm just thinking of all of those people who are watching their houses and belongings float away, including farmers whose Black Angus cattle have washed up on Old Bar Beach. I just can't imagine what it's like for those towns and those people to have to go through that again. And I'm seeing, it's breaking all records, and really it circles back round to what we were talking about, this kind of ongoing crazy climate wars that are going on while people and their animals are being washed away. It just does my head in that there's such cognitive dissonance between politics and the real world.
It's been devastating to watch, and also I think brings up a lot of terror. I've had family as far as North Queensland and in northern New South Wales already face unprecedented floods this year, and now this on the mid-north coast and inland. It's scary. Mike, what is it for you? What can't you get out of your head?
Well, to bring it down to a much more superficial level, a much less serious topic, on Thursday morning, Ange Postecoglou became the first Australian coach to win a major European trophy with his club Tottenham. I think I have pretty different views on Ange than many football followers in Australia, so I probably better leave it at that.
Oh, our contrarian Mike. So this morning at 8:20 a.m, I did see an incredibly drunk English guy on the street in a Tottenham jersey screaming ecstatically into his phone. And I knew he was walking home, obviously on the phone to family and friends back in England, which is always a joyous sight, I think.
Yeah, I can't really be happy for them. Sorry.
Thank you so much for joining me this week, Mike.
Thanks, Bridie.
And thank you, Gabby.
Thanks, Bridie and Mike.
We're not going to leave it so long between visits, Gabby.
Yeah, hopefully not.